It was probably because I got high so often that I was able to maintain this crazy double life, pushing around my repressed emotional weight like Sisyphus with his boulder. Even when a needle broke off in my arm while I was getting high, I thought I was invincible. I didn't even believe the doctors in the emergency room who told me that if I didn't change my life, I would die. It wasn't until 1984, when I was walking around with a high fever and a severe staph infection that landed me in the emergency room again, that I realized how close to death I was. I don't know why it often takes a crisis or a fastball from the universe knocking us off our feet for us to finally have our ass on fire enough to act. Maybe it's a flaw in the human condition, or maybe it's simply part of the human condition. In any case, the gift of desperation compels us to move forward. Without fire in our lives, we sometimes don't have the internal combustion necessary to change and take risks. We get too comfortable being comfortable. This is a passage from the book The Mindful Athlete by George Mumford. What George shares in this passage isn't about survival. It's about awakening. He wasn't searching for enlightenment. He was searching for peace. His body was breaking down, his life was unraveling, and he had nowhere else to run. Twice, he came face to face with death, and both times it forced him to confront what he'd been avoiding all along: himself. And that's the thing about chaos. It strips away everything that isn't real. It burns down the illusion of control until all that's left is what's true. Most of us don't move to growth when things are easy. We wait until the universe knocks us on our ass, until the pain of staying the same outweighs the fear of change. But that moment of collapse, that's not failure. That's the beginning of clarity. Because when everything falls apart, you finally see what's been holding you together. And for George, that anchor became mindfulness. Not as an escape, but as a way to meet the storm with stillness. To train the mind the same way an athlete trains the body. So that when chaos comes, as it always will, you can move with it instead of being swallowed by it. So as we begin this episode, take a breath. Feel the rise and fall of your chest. And I'll ask you the same question George asked himself. Are you here now? All right, welcome back to the I Am Here Now podcast. In this episode, we're exploring The Mindful Athlete, a book written by George Mumford, the man who taught mindfulness to some of the greatest athletes in the world. From Michael Jordan to Kobe Bryant, George helped legends find stillness in the middle of intensity. But his message goes far beyond sports. At its core, The Mindful Athlete is about the inner game, the one we all play. It's about training the mind the same way we train the body, with discipline, consistency, and compassion. George's journey shows us that mindfulness isn't something reserved for calm spaces or quiet retreats. It's forged in chaos, in the moment when life feels heavy, uncertain, and loud. For George, that chaos wasn't theoretical. It was real. It came in the form of addiction, pain, and hitting rock bottom. Twice, in fact. His life was unraveling, and in the breaking, he began to wake up. Through mindfulness, he discovered clarity amid the storm, not by escaping it, but by learning to sit with it. And that's why I love this book, really, because it's not theory, it's survival turned into wisdom. And in this episode, we'll explore how the foundations of mindfulness that George lays out, awareness, patience, trust, and letting go, can bring clarity through and amid the chaos. We'll look at what it means to train your attention, to come back again and again, and to find strength in stillness when everything around you is moving fast. So whether you're an athlete, an artist, or just someone trying to make sense of the noise, this conversation is learning about how to meet that chaos, not to run from it, to move through it with awareness, to train your mind like a muscle. Because as George says, peace isn't found outside the storm. It's found in how we stand within it, here and now. So to get us started, before we get into the principles and the lessons of the mindful athlete, I think it's important to start with the story behind the teacher. Because George Mumford's wisdom didn't come from the comfort of privilege. It came amidst the chaos. And so George talks about his story as he begins Pain brought me to mindfulness, not any desire to reach nirvana or pop out of any chrysalis. It was unlearning certain habits and thought patterns hardwired in my brain and walking through my pain rather than avoiding it. That ultimately put me on a joyful journey of self discovery. And really, I kind of want to interrupt here and talk about that. This is also where I discovered mindfulness and meditation for myself in the pain. And when my habits and perspective of the world led to great misery with, a certain event and events, mindfulness became a means of like kind of how to deal and cope with that pain and hardship, and hopefully to break the patterns that I was committing myself to that created that suffering. And I think this could be very common for many people to turn to mindfulness when life gets hard. And I know I've said this before with the Wherever You Go, There You Are podcast episodes, but, ultimately, what I learned is that meditation, mindfulness doesn't really get rid of the pain, but it just teaches you how to be in it. And so George continues from this by saying, I grew up in Dorchester, Boston in the 50s and 60s. Here's how the Urban Dictionary defines the place: a ghetto in Boston where hood rats and thugs kill each other over basketball courts, street corners, and anything else they feel like. I learned to shut up and be, and I carried that oppression around like an albatross. Whatever emotional pain I experienced, I unconsciously buried in my body. No wonder pain became my constant companion. I think there are many ideas about ourselves and habits that we pick up and learn throughout our lives, whether it be from our parents or upbringing. A lot of times these can lead to us dimming our natural light and can create suffering around us. And here Mumford talks about how he internalized his thoughts, his emotions, his pain, because he was raised to just shut up and be. But I believe there is something for all of us that we've held on to that doesn't serve us in a similar way. And I really want to pose this question to you. What are the patterns or thoughts that are blocking your light from shining? And I guess, how are you internalizing it? Mumford talks about here how he buried it in his body, and that because of this, pain became a constant companion for him. But I think there are ways all of us are internalizing these thoughts, these emotions that don't serve us. So I'm just kind of posing the question here of where and how are you internalizing your own suffering? And Mumford continues with his own story by saying, I had no real spiritual foundation, though I longed for spirit. I found it first in John Barleycorn. I was given my first taste of beer at about the same time I learned to walk. I liked that enough to move on to more sophisticated spirits, like my father's Seagram 7 whiskey, that I enjoyed in private. At an early age, I found God in getting high and leaving my body, floating into space and taking off. Anything that would get me away from the experience of the physical, emotional pain was welcome. I floated further into space in my teens when a group of kids I met at the YMCA turned me on to heroin. On heroin, my pain lifted and my spirit soared even higher. I could suddenly speak out and be gregarious without fear. And just to interrupt, here I wrote that our spiritual needs will get met one way or another. You can find God or peace in religion, meditation, presence, nature. But as Mumford highlights in his own journey, you can also find it in getting high and leaving your body, leaving your circumstance. And this is kind of how Mumford dealt with his pain at a young age. And, he talks about that in order to access his spiritual needs when he was younger, he turned to drugs such as heroin. But in many ways, he wasn't really addressing the chaos of his life. He was just escaping it. And he was using drugs as a way to do this. I don't know about you, but in a way, I could kind of relate to this. Of course, I've never done a heroin, but I remember when I was younger, there are ways that I was escaping the trauma, the suffering that I was creating in my own life, or the suffering that was going on around me. In many ways, I wasn't actually addressing the chaos or the problems or the suffering, but I was really just trying to run away, escape from it, or push it to the side. And ultimately, I learned that this doesn't really help to cure or help the chaos at all. If anything, it adds to it. You're almost just repeating the same suffering over and over again without ever addressing the issue. And I feel like this is what George might have been doing here as well. So George continues with his own story by saying, I had yet to find that kingdom of heaven within, but I had certainly found my little helper. And then he goes on, and I said this in the intro, but I'm going to just repeat it here. It was probably because I got high so often that I was able to maintain this crazy double life, pushing around my repressed emotion weight like Sisyphus with his boulder. Even when a needle broke off in my arm while I was getting high, I thought I was invincible. I didn't even believe the doctors in the emergency room who told me that if I didn't change my life, I would die. It wasn't until 1984 when I was walking around with a high fever and a severe staph infection that landed me in the emergency room again that I realized how close to death I was. And then, pushing around the unrepressed emotional weight like Sisyphus was once again something I connected with here. I know for me, because I never learned how to deal with the emotional weight or was always taught to not show emotions, I push it around eternally, like Sisyphus pushing around his boulder uphill just for it to roll back down where it began. And so I think this is something that is super common when we don't learn how to express our emotions or express our thoughts. We internalize them. And in the process, it can lead to us living a crazy double life with the things that we're using to avoid the chaos, avoid the uncertainty. And although all of us might not have a similar story as Mumford with a near-death experience, I think in a way, we are kind of killing ourselves by repressing or running away from our pain or the chaos going on in our lives. Because whatever it is, in order to truly be alive and to live freely in our purest form, what we need to do is be able to confront and sit in and be with the emotions, the fears, the chaos. And, this is probably what we need to turn towards is the fears and the chaos in order to really live our fullest lives. And so Mumford continues on from this as he says, freedom's just another word for nothing to lose. That's where I was. I had nothing to lose because I'd already lost everything. In a strange, messed up way, I was free. Free to start over from scratch. Free to let my guard down and ask for help. Free to step out of my comfort zone and take risks in an effort to reinvent myself, because the alternative was to die. And so Mumford's saying here that he had nothing to lose. And in a way, in a strange, messed up way, that this was the best thing to happen to him because it almost forced him to seek help, to confront what was going on. But, although we might not be in a similar stage of Mumford where we had two near-death experiences, realistically, we are still confronted with this, that if we are unable to change, we're going to continue down the same path of suffering rather than gaining clarity about how to move forward. And in the process, we also are kind of dying in the process. If we're not truly here, truly able to live this life to the fullest, we really are nowhere. And this is kind of talked about in Wherever You Go, There You Are too. But, there's a vitality to this. There's like something here that I think we all need to hold importance to, because if we do not, then I think in the process we are dying as well. So George Mumford discovered mindfulness amidst the chaos of life, the pressure, the pain, the self-doubt. All of it pushed him toward escape. For George, that escape became heroin. Addiction became the place where the noise quieted, even if it was just for a moment. And that's where his journey began. Not at the mountaintop, but in the pit. In the moment of collapse when everything he built to protect himself stopped working. That's where mindfulness found him. Or maybe where he finally became open enough to find it. And what's most powerful about Mumford's story is that out of all that chaos, the pain, the addiction, the rock bottom moments, something real emerged. And, not instantly, not perfectly, but slowly. Through all the darkness, he began to see himself more clearly. And this is where the books really start to get special because it's not about theory or philosophy, it's really about lived experience. And he really earned every insight the hard way. And, that's why I love this book, is because it's survival turned into wisdom. And so Mumford talks about having his ass on fire really forced him to seek his own truth. And he points to this by saying, during this time in my life, I slowly came to understand how having your ass on fire, or what I call AOF, not only moves us human beings into action, but compels us to seek our truths and act with conviction in life. You have to begin somewhere, as Pema Chodron puts it in her book, The Places That Scare You. Right here is a good place to start. Start where you are. This is true in life and in sports. There might not be a right time to start. In fact, often what prevents people from moving forward is the daunting sense that they'll never get where they intended to go. So why even bother starting? So I got out of my own macho way, let my guard down completely, and began my process. And I think here that failure and the fear of failure can prevent us from going after dreams or really making the changes that we need to. A lot of times we kind of need to get out of our own way and just start from wherever we are. And, George Mumford continues from this by saying, I knew that it would be much harder to recover if I was unemployed. So I did whatever it took to keep my job and my sanity intact. But without the veil of drinks and drugs masking my pain, it all came rushing back. The intense chronic lower back pain, the migraines, the craving for short-term relief that I'd appeased with substance abuse for years. There were days when it was so intensely difficult to stay sober that I had to step into the men's room at work, close a stall door, get on my knees, and recite the serenity prayer to myself. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so this is where George found clarity. This is what change can really look like. It can look like rock bottom on the bathroom floor, praying for the strength to carry on. And I think this is an important thing to remember. Change isn't going to be pretty all the time. A lot of times it probably won't be. It's going to be a struggle. But what is on the other side of that is clarity amidst the chaos. And so Mumford begins to share how he came to that clarity as he continues. But somehow things start to shift. One day, a psychotherapist referred me to a stress management program offered by my company's HMO. This was back when stress management was the term used for mindfulness. The program introduced me to techniques for managing chronic pain that included meditation and yoga. It was a slow but powerful revelation. I learned how to be in the moment, slow things down, practice bare awareness, and listen to my body. Invariably, my body told me what I needed. And so here, change for George Mumford began when he was able to listen. And listening, it sounds simple, but listening, as we have discussed with Wherever You Go, There You Are, and with the miracle of mindfulness, is very hard to commit to. Because to listen to your body, your thoughts, your emotions, your mind means to listen non-judgmentally. And, this is the hard part, because when it feels like my body, my mind, my thoughts, my emotions, when the ego kind of steps in, it means that you have to be able to sit with those emotions and thoughts, even though they're scary, even though they might not reflect you and how you are in your essence. But to listen means to be there for them. Listen to them, understand them non-judgmentally. And, this could be really hard to do, as George Mumford points to here. The first time I tried to meditate, it would have been easier to bench press 50-pound weights than sit still. I went to my first sitting meditation retreat back in the day when it was not common for African Americans to meditate with predominantly white people in a small New England town. When I was told to buy a cushion for meditation, I went out and bought an actual sofa cushion. That's how clueless I was. Just sitting for any length of time was painful. I had no flexibility in my body and could not get comfortable no matter how hard I tried. And then there was my mind, flitting around and wandering, fixating on sensations, anxieties, and cravings that came up. But the practice of mindfulness, as I'll address in these pages, slowly taught me how to work through this. And so George Mumford learned how to sit still and listen to what was coming up. And this assisted him to begin to find clarity amidst the chaos. And this clarity was so strong, and he began to get such promising results that eventually he quit his financial job and began to serve others through meditation, starting with the Massachusetts Correctional Facility inmates. And he talks about this experience and how he helped these inmates with mindfulness by saying, through the practice of mindfulness, I help them understand the operation of their minds and emotions, teaching them how to calmly detach from outside provocations and habitual patterns of reaction. Of course, I'm not suggesting that people can meditate their way out of injustice or out of bad karma they've created, but we can cultivate control of ourselves and choose with a clear mind how to respond appropriately and effectively in our lives with calmness and wisdom. And this is what meditation and mindfulness is really about. It's not about changing the circumstances we're in. It's not about blocking the injustices and pain from coming into our lives. It's really about cultivating control so that we can have the space to choose with a clear mind how to respond to events that come to us. And I think Jon Kabat-Zinn did a great job of illustrating this with wherever you go, there you are. It's about just creating the space. So now that you have the control and the power to respond the way that you want to, rather than just naturally reacting. And so Mumford continues from this by pointing to, I also came to realize that you couldn't solve problems with the same consciousness that created them. It's only in changing your consciousness that you can solve problems and transform your game, whatever it is and wherever you're playing it. And I honestly just love this part. You can't solve problems with the same consciousness that created them. It's only in changing your consciousness that you can solve the problems. I think this is so true. This is what mindfulness really does. It's not going to prevent things from coming, but once again, it's about just changing the consciousness that we show up in life with. And in the process, the way we show up to the problems that we encounter on a day-to-day will be different. Mumford continues on by saying, in many ways, my own path is a reflection of Buddha's Four Noble Truths. Life brings suffering no matter who we are, but there is a path for all of us that leads us out of suffering and onto that joyful journey of self-discovery, no matter how painful our personal history might be. And that is what's so powerful about Mumford's story. Out of all that chaos, he discovered a sense of clarity that didn't come from escaping life, but from being fully in it. And from that place of stillness and awareness, he began to uncover what he calls the five superpowers: mindfulness, concentration, insight, right effort, and trust. The rest of the mindful athlete really dives into these five superpowers. And honestly, each superpower could be an episode of its own. And at some point, it probably will, because they're really that deep and practical. But for today, I kind of just wanted to focus on this foundation that he built, the way stillness and presence allowed him to find clarity amidst the chaos, because that's where the real transformation started. But, I also want to kind of go into the five superpowers just so you guys have a little understanding about it. So he kind of starts to introduce the five superpowers by saying, the five superpowers are mindfulness, concentration, insight, right effort, and trust. These spiritual superpowers are interconnected and they work together. Buddhism sometimes calls the first three powers mindfulness, concentration, and insight the threefold training. Our unconscious mind contains the seeds of all these energies. You can cultivate these three energies throughout the day in whatever activity you're engaged. They help you live every moment of life deeply. They bring you joy and happiness and help you to handle your own suffering and the suffering in the people around you. The fourth power, right effort or diligence, is the energy that makes us steadfast in our practice. Cognitive function improves when we have a positive state of mind. This is all about how we show up, the state that we show up in. If we show up with high vibes, a high frequency, and just a positivity towards us, rather than the strong will of having to force things, of needing to accomplish things, but if we show up for the sake of just being joy, that is the right effort that he's talking about. It's through this that we can maintain consistency and really not burn ourselves out. So that I think is what right effort is really pointing to. And then he wraps it up by saying the last of the five powers is trust. It can also be seen as faith or confidence. But the way I like to look at it is courage. Having courage to delve into the unknown and trust what is found there makes the practice of mindfulness and the other powers possible. As Mumford is saying here, the only way that we can practice the other powers is if we have the trust, really the courage to delve into all of it, to have the courage to really be present in life and trust that this is going to lead us where we need to get to. And he finishes this section by saying, as my friend Sharon Salzberg puts it in her book, Loving Kindness, completeness and unity constitute our most fundamental nature as living beings. Our intrinsic wholeness is always present, and we can recognize it. Being a mindful athlete involves living this truth for yourself, because there is no separating who you are on the court, field, or yoga mat from who you are in the world at large. That intrinsic wholeness serves you wherever you are, and in whatever you're doing. Everything is connected. And this is how Mumford finishes this section. And, it really points to the harmony of everything, how we show up to the yoga mat, to our meditation practice, to sport. That is who we show up to the world and to life. And so, if we could practice it in our little practices of meditation, in our practices in the sport that we're in, it is then that we can then step forward and practice it in the big game of life. And so, at the end of the day, what Mumford shows us is that chaos isn't something we have to escape. It's something we can move through. And that clarity we're all searching for, it doesn't wait on the other side of the storm. It's found right here in the middle of it when we choose to be still enough to listen, to breathe, and to see things as they are. And if you want to go deeper into the practice and ideas that help Mumford find clarity, I highly recommend reading The Mindful Athlete. His breakdown of the 5 superpowers, mindfulness, concentration, insight, right effort, and trust, really gives you the tools that you can use to meet life with more peace and purpose. And, like I said, when he breaks down each of these, he does so with more detail in the following chapters. And I'm hoping at some point I'm able to actually break down each of these 5 superpowers. I'll probably do that in a later episode, because really that's what the journey is about. It's not about escaping chaos, but learning how to find clarity within it, here and now. As I wrap up this episode, this is the question that I want to pose to you guys. Are you guys finding clarity amidst the chaos? And per usual, I hope you guys find presence. I hope you guys find grounding. And I hope you guys find clarity amidst the chaos here and now. And like I say at the end of every episode, aloha.